And so the great innovation of art in this period, which reminds us of the human suffering and the human death of Christ on the cross. As a matter of fact, I have a line in here which I probably remember, so I don't really have to do this. But the fact is, there it is. It's from the Meditations of the Life of Christ, which I think you know is written by an anonymous 13th century Franciscan. In one of the lines in there, he says, "Turn your eyes away from his divinity for a little while and consider him purely as a man." This is, and this is my point, this is what puts the human in humanism. And you can hear all this other stuff about picking up, and there's a lot of that in humanism, picking up the writings of the ancients, the achievements of the ancients, the greatness of man, yada, yada. You know what makes man great? The fact that Jesus took on human form. This is the beginning of humanism. This is where it all starts. It starts with this concept, this new revolution in spirituality, where we start to look at Jesus not as the big divinity sitting on the back of, sitting up against the golden background of a mosaic inside one of our spectacular churches, watching us, loving us, yet somehow distant and very monumental in his divinity. Francis and his order and the Dominicans and some others begin to bring in a way for the people to meditate and think about Christ in relation to their own lives and in their own human experience. And Christ's own willingness to take on our human experience. By dint of that, it makes the human being greater. And it makes the human being and the human being's experiences and reactions and emotions and way of being, it exalts it enough to be represented in art. The greatest transformation that will happen in this era is that we go from looking at a lifeless Christ to suddenly looking at the people in the story, and those people develop personalities, and those people develop human reactions, and we can relate to them. Our experience, thanks to this view of humanism, our experience becomes worthy of representation in monumental art. So, here we have some more. The evolution of this crucifix I find very beautiful, and you have to forgive me, but I do often indulge the fact that I simply like to look at certain pictures. So sometimes I put them up just because I want to see them. And the next artist to approach this subject is a man named Giotto Pisano. And you'll recognize, again, here are the things we're looking at. The head is bent, the eyes are closed. So that's obviously an indication of the lifeless Christ. You'll frequently see the wound in the side, not always. And then you have the hands which are spread open on the cross. So you have a big, open, widespread hand of the cross. The idea is this idea of Jesus embracing you. It was always that in the earlier crucifixes. Jesus is open and embracing you. And it takes a while to evolve this iconography, which is very good and very important, but they want to evolve this iconography in something that evokes more compassion. You will notice that we're not so interested in representing human bodies, qua human bodies. This fascinating symmetrical six-pack it doesn't really make a whole, this idea of like these sort of symmetrical muscles along here. The most important thing in art like this is that Jesus be harmonious, that he have a kind of mathematical symmetry, and that's going to have to go eventually. The body of Christ arcs into this very expressionist S-curve. So we do have a lifeless Christ, but we don't have an observation of nature. So we are already meditating on the fact that, yes, Christ did die on the cross for us, but we aren't taking that next step in to imagine what it was like to die on that cross. The next man is Chima Boy, and we're getting so close here. The body of Christ continues with the open hands. His head is turned. It's a little bit more sort of resting on his shoulder. It gives you a slightly greater sense of pathos. And the proportions of the body begin to neaten up a little bit less of that sort of dramatic S-curve. And why? And then, oh, hold on a second. What's happening here? All right. I don't know why that's doing that. But anyway, that was the one we were looking at before. And this is the one, at any rate, that is the most startling. Chima Boy is the student of, is the master of Giotto. And Chima Boy works for Franciscans left and right. Chima Boy is the one who does the fresco cycle along the apse of the Upper Basilica of Assisi. He is the Franciscan painter par excellence. As a matter of fact, his whole career, it takes off. He's a very, very famous painter. One of the things you'll be noticing, all the pictures I showed you before, did we have a name for the artist? No. But now the artists begin to have names, they begin to have reputations. Chima Boy's name is particularly colorful. It means ox head. Chima Boy meets, according to the famous tradition, he meets a young man in Tuscany whose name is Giotto. Takes young Giotto under his wing, undoubtedly introduces him to the Franciscans. Giotto will become the Franciscan painter par excellence. He is a painter who gives us this image of the crucifixion of Christ, which it's in Florence. It's in the church of Santa Maria Novella. I think it's probably the most profoundly moving image, especially if you can transport yourself back to 1304. When that crucifix was first put into place and what it must have been like to be the faithful looking at that crucifix. I'll show you where it goes in a minute. It is a life-size, it's huge. It's not quite to the ceiling, but it's considerably taller than life-size. So you already have an image of a Jesus who is, of your dimensions on the cross. The observations of this one, they come from nature. Giotto has meditated long and hard on what it would be to die and to see a body on the cross. It has the same effect in art as there was a book written right before Mel Gibson's Passion. It's A Doctor at Calvary, is that what it's called? And so many people are really, it affected, whether or not you've read it, it's affected the way that you think about the crucifixion of Christ, because we hear about the lashes, we hear about what happened when the spear pierced his side. This is literally a doctor who looks clinically at what happened to Christ, and that sort of scientific analysis of this physical destruction of a body, it has added to our understanding and to our compassion and our feelings to the image of the crucifixion of Christ. This has the exact same effect. Look at the hands of Christ, which are cupped over the nails. So now you have the body, you had them pressed back, but now the body is given up and the hands are falling forward, but the nails pin the hands to the wood. The head and shoulders literally slump forward. The picture is not good enough to give you the hair, which is actually falling slightly towards his shoulders. His body, that symmetry is gone, and his body, the belly slumps. So you see how the muscles, the energy, the tension that holds the body erect is completely gone, and you see the life has left this body. The body actually is placed, it's uncomfortably placed against the cross, as you would be. His shoulders are forward, the back of his body presses against the cross, so you get that kind of, that soft object versus the hard object. Can you imagine walking into a church and seeing this incredibly vivid, realistic, in art we actually are supposed to call this naturalistic image of a man dying on a cross above you. The placement of this work was on the rood screen. All of the churches in this era were constructed with a rood screen. You can see the pulpit. This is the site of the Eucharistic liturgy, and the people stood on the other side. And so as you were sitting there, knowing that on the other side of the screen you have the representation of the sacrifice of Christ, you were standing there with that cross tilted toward you, literally tilted toward you on the rood screen, looking up at an image that was so realistic you're a little worried that drops of blood are going to land on you. It is unbelievably powerful at engaging the faithful on the real human suffering and death that Jesus endured on the cross. The same image which shows us the same image that shows us the use of these historiated crosses, it also gives us the other great gift of Francis to our understanding of the humanity of Christ. This is a scene from the Upper Basilica which shows the Nativity at Greccio, the famous recreation of the Nativity. that took place in a little town called Greccio. And what happened is that this celebration for the Nativity was something that took place without sermons in this era. This was a period where there was very few sermons. And so simply would have been the Mass, this sort of standing, this almost like a tableau vivant of the scene. But Francis shows up. And you can't possibly have Francis at an event without having Francis speak. And so Francis starts to speak. He starts giving his sermon, and as Francis speaks, he begins to glow, and he begins to set everyone on fire with his words, and at the same time, really focusing in on this Christ child. So it becomes, between his words and his actions and the visual event, it transports all those people on the hillside to this event, to the Nativity of Christ. And so that idea of representing Jesus as either an infant born in a cold stable or in a cold cave in a cold night, and that delicacy and vulnerability of his infant skin, then the man who was beaten and suffered, and that vulnerability of the human body that suffered and died for us, that is the new humanism. And the new humanism gets its first glorious trial run in the Arena Chapel of Padua. It's a private chapel at the time. It was something, what I'm trying to get across to you is how avant-garde Giotto and the Franciscans are. I am certain that when that Santa Maria Novella crucifix went in, there were plenty of parishioners who went over to the priest and said, Father, I think that picture's a little troubling, and I think maybe you should take it down and put one of the happy Jesuses up. I find that it's very hard for me to pray in front of that, Father. I don't think this is going to last. We shouldn't follow these fads. So the trial run for places like this has to be. Is this sounding familiar? The trial run for things like this, it needs to actually be in places that are a little bit more, you know what you're getting into. So when Enrico Scrovegni builds himself a chapel because he's ridiculously wealthy and he made his money off usury, and he's a little concerned about what happens later on, he builds a chapel. The Franciscans are down the street. They're building St. Anthony's of Padua, and they've got Giotto working left and right. And he waltzes over to the Franciscans. He goes, hey, you guys got someone who could come do my chapel? And they go, well, Giotto's finishing up here. Do you want him to come over and do that? So Giotto, we believe in Agostinian, and Enrico Scrovegni, they all get together and they design this tiny little chapel that is really going to be, the Arena Chapel means that it was built on top of the old amphitheater of Padua. It means it's in the outskirts of the city. So it wasn't even in the heart of the city. It was a little chapel on a private piece of land, like in the outskirts of town. Then they're halfway through the decorating of the chapel, and the Pope puts an indulgence on it. So all of a sudden, it's a place where the faithful are going to go as part of a pilgrimage. It's a place which is connected to an indulgence. So this goes from 0 to 60 before it's even done. But again, when people walk in there, they understand that you're not dealing with a place that is supposed to be it's not the same thing as St. Peter's, which is the parish church of the whole world. It's something that's much more of an intimate space. Same rule goes for the Sistine Chapel. This is to give you, again, a running start. This is the San Clemente frescoes with the stories of San Clemente. This is in the Lower Basilica of San Clemente in Rome. It's from the 11th century, although these new art historians have redated it based on political propaganda of an anti-pope. Just telling you, this is what's going on. And then over here we have the Arena Chapel, which is from 1305. Again, this story, this is the return of the relics of Saint Clement to Rome. Look at the way people are represented. Look at the way these are the jubilant people. Look at the space of the church. And just look at the way the story is told to you, the elements, the still life elements from the thoroughfares, the way the crowds of people are placed together, the way the spaces of the chapel. And now take a look at what Giotto unveils for you. Forgive me for 1 second. I also have I put this in here because I have a tremendous fondness for this particular image, because I always think it helps us understand a lot about what the Franciscans are proposing. This is not by Giotto, although there's a big argument about this, but it's not by Giotto. It's probably by an artist named Pietro Cavallini, but again, this is one of those things where So an art history brawl starts over this. This is the story of Francis's renouncing of his worldly goods. And this is just to let you know that more than just Giotto is thinking along these lines. Pietro Cavallini perhaps as well. This is the famous fight that breaks out. You've all been to Assisi, correct? Or almost all of you have been to Assisi? Yeah. Assisi's got this. So remember where Francis's house is? So you walk up Assisi. For those of you who don't know it, you go from the bottom of the hill where the basilica is. You walk up this unbelievably steep hill because everything in Assisi is uphill. Even when you're going downhill, you have to go uphill. So you go up this unbelievably steep hill, and the first place of like relief is the big open square where they have the old temple of Minerva, and this used to be the middle of the town. And then it goes up a little further, and that's where the aristocrats and St. Clair's family were from. And so around the corner, literally around the corner from the main square, is where Francis's father's shop was. And I like to think, I mean, one day I was standing there, I just began to imagine this whole scene. So to imagine, there's Francis, he's coming back again, he's taking his dad merchandise, his dad catches him. And he's like, Francis, I work so hard so that you can, dress like a proper boy, that you can have a job, that you can be like me, that you can take advantage of all the things I worked for, you can carry on the family name. And Francis is like, yeah, Dad, I got to go sell this stuff because I got to rebuild the church. Are you listening, Francis? Well, not really, because I've got to go and I've got to get this done, and because God asked me to do this. Would you stop with this God asked you to do stuff, Francis? I mean, come on, what about your responsibilities to the family? Now, in good fashion of teenagers, Francis naturally storms out of the house, right? Is that invariably the teenager storms out of the house. 2 steps later, he is standing in the piazza. In true Italian fashion, the father storms after him. And in classic Italian form, next thing you know, you have street theater. Francis here, his father here, screaming their heads off. And in Italy, nobody ever discreetly looks away. Like, oh dear, this must be a personal moment. I'll look over here. No. The Italians, they get popcorn. And they're like, oh, no, this is great. This is good stuff, man. So you imagine all the Italians standing around. And I can't help but feel that every single Italian was on the father's side. You can see, oh, that poor man. He's done everything for that boy. That boy doesn't appreciate anything. Oh, did you see how he's dressed? Oh, mamma mia. And so the Francis, in this ultimate fit, as you remember, he rips off all his clothes, he hands it to his father, and then we have this wonderful connection, beautiful art. Francis's hands reaching upwards and the hand of God reaching downwards. The gap between the father and the religious, the bishop and the bishop is to the right, and this, it's all clergy on this side. You'll notice the tonsure. You'll be thrilled they got rid of that, aren't you? And then on this side, you see the kind of chaos of the townspeople. Now, here is what's so new. Look at, we've got Francis and God, that makes perfect sense. We have Francis and even the father, that makes perfect sense. Take a look at the bishop. I love this. He's obviously great presence of mind, whips something on, and then he looks over like, now what do we do? And it's just, he's got this great communication, and even right down to that expression on his face, like, so we get him now, huh? And over here, look at the other man, the friend of the father, who's literally restraining, hold me back, man, hold me back. And then down here, the kids in the corner, Francis is in so much trouble. Francis is naked. I mean, it's amazing. You have this street, the reactions, and it makes us understand a little bit more, a little bit greater, that real live everyday context of the witness of Francis. Again, Pietro Cavallini, who is getting a brief moment of attention here, he is also the man who gives us the swan song of mosaics. The Franciscans will phase out mosaics. I told you yesterday there will be a moment when mosaics get phased out. Mosaics are wickedly expensive. I don't know if I bet it doesn't take a lot. Oh, actually, if any of you have ordered mosaics, they're still wickedly expensive. Mosaics are wickedly expensive. They are time-consuming, they are difficult to make, the materials are impossible to put together, and the fact is that fresco costs much, much, much less. Furthermore, fresco allows for narrative possibilities that mosaics don't have. Mosaics are great when you want to make a gold background and that shimmering image of God against the gold background. But fresco, when you need to tell a story, when you need to get the excitement going, fresco is far more versatile. But Pietro Cavallini, who knew Rome's love for mosaics, we love our mosaics in Rome. We hate to give them up. He made one attempt in 1291 to force the mosaic medium to work in a narrative context, and he succeeded. It's very, very beautiful, except only he could do it. This is the Nativity of Mary. There's Anne. She's reclining on her birth bed like you'd see in ancient art. There is a still life in the background. We are in 1291. You are looking at a still life. They are bringing her bread and cheese and wine and something fruity in a basket and ice chips and probably some Ben & Jerry's ice cream after the whole birthing experience. And then in the foreground, you have the nursemaid, and you have little baby Mary who's being readied for her first bath. And as the maid pours water into the basin, the other woman reaches forward to test the water. 1291. When in the art, any art before that, would you have an image of something so everyday, so natural, and yet something that's considered, it was always considered beneath art, but that tenderness of watching, testing the water, because after all, that little baby child will be put into the water. It makes, all of a sudden, it makes the mind refocus that these people are not abstract figures that just sit on the backgrounds of some of these glittering walls, but these people lived human lives in human flesh, in human sensibilities and human sensitivities. Now, we're back to the Arena Chapel and my two favorite paintings. We start out with, as you know, Joachim. He goes to do his sacrifice. You have no kids, get out of here. He goes out into the desert because he's so ashamed. The amazing opening of the Arena Chapel has Joachim showing up in the desert. He shows up in front of the shepherds, and you have a whole new era in the history of art. You don't actually need a voice bubble. Giotto actually looks at human beings and captures their different positions. There is no mistaking the state of mind of that man in his heavy cloak, his shoulders tucked in, his head bent down. The shame, the heaviness, the burden, the weariness, you feel for that man. He stands a little bit apart, doesn't know if he should go here, go there. He's lost. To make sure we focus on him, we don't have the completely blank background, but he gives us this butte, right? I'm getting it. He gives us this rock formation that focuses your attention like a screen. There's no looking any further than that. You are focused completely on Joachim, and then he throws a couple trees. As a matter of fact, this looks a bit like the landscape outside, now that I think of it. And then you have the two shepherds. The shepherds, look at what they're doing. The shepherds are literally looking at each other. One is looking at the other out of the corner of his eye like, how did we get this guy? I mean, it reminds me of like high schoolers when the uncool person comes up and starts talking to them, and the high schoolers kind of look at each other like, how do we get out of here? These human observations, how people act. All of a sudden, we begin to think of the story not as some Bible story that we have to know because it's part of how Mary came into being, but we begin to imagine what we would have done if we were in these situations. We are invited to think about what we would have done by figures like the one who's turned to us, but I'm going to get back to that in a minute. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, we have Saint Anne, who's wondering, where did my husband go? She's in this room. Take a look at the proportion and the perspective of that room. Space is getting realistic. We are looking into a room. There's her chest where she keeps her clothes. Those were her objects for spinning. There's the bed. And there's a little window at the top as she prays. And as she prays, through the window, in comes something that does not usually show up in people's bedrooms. It's an angel. And people have heard me say this before. I love that angel because it doesn't fit in the window. There is something comically uncomfortable about that angel coming into the space. His wings are kind of stuck somewhere over the lintel. And he's just like, oh, hold on, I'm on my way in. And I love it because it's really such a good expression of how uncomfortable and how awkward the supernatural is when it makes an introduction into our nice, orderly, neat lives. We have everything we have everything set out. We've got our little room. We've got our little stuff arranged in our room. We've got everything put away in its proper place. And in comes this angel. Like, I need to talk to you right now. And your life is going to change. And so that I love that discomfort. I love that awkwardness because it's such a really good explanation of how it feels when God actually comes at the door. He doesn't, kind of make an appointment and show up and say, I'll see you next week, and he's sitting in the waiting room. He's like, I gotta come talk to you now. The great touch, which just immediately softens all of that, is the maid over in the corner, who hears voices from the mistress's room and is, what's going on in there? So again, that very human context where, there she is, there's Anne having the scene, this moment's going to change her life, and outside going, so last night, do you know what I heard in her room? So this the way that these things happen in a real world. Oh, be nice to me. And then we have the meeting at the Golden Gate, a very, very frequently interpreted work. But the reason why I'm interested in this is this look at the natural reaction between people. The kiss this is considered the first real kiss in the history of art, history of Christian art. It is very, very beautiful. It is very much an image of two people who love. You have the love and relief all rolled into one, and at the same time you have obviously something that is drawn from an observation of nature. Her hand goes around the back of his head, that sort of staring at each other. It's a very, again, that sense of love and that sense of that finding each other. The story gives it, all you need are some violins and some fading, and you've got a rom-com on your hands. I love the contrast between the other kiss that Giotto shows, which is the kiss of Judas. And so that beautiful, beautiful, loving, natural gesture between husband and wife versus that distorted, horrible expression as Judas moves in. And Jesus, who looks at him so clinically, just understanding that sort of clinical observation of Jesus as he sees what's coming, he knows what's happening. It's a remarkable contrast, and they're literally across from each other. We then have the Nativity, and the reason why I'm showing you the Nativity is to point out the real reason for this kind of imagery. And the real reason for a Giotto and how the Franciscans are involved in this more directly than thus far I've been saying. This is a lovely scene of the birth of Christ in a cave. It's got the angels dancing around. You've got Joseph who's sleeping because apparently it was very tiring, all that childbirth. The Joseph sleeping scenes just never do a whole lot for me. The most important figure, obviously this is the most important figure, but the figure that is so innovative, what I want you to see here is the figure that Giotto invented. Giotto invented a new figure in the history of art. It's the figure with his back to you. And that is the final sense of something so new and so important that's changing. Why are the Franciscans so interested in furthering this art? Why are they sponsoring these Cavallinis and Chima Boys and Giottos and all of these different artistic spaces? What are they trying to do? They just want to entertain you? Is this edutainment on a theological level? Hey, like us because we'll show you some pretty pictures, and I promise you won't go to sleep because we'll put lots of colors in it. No. In seeing, there's a whole lot more. As a matter of fact, the whole philosophy of getting people like Giotto involved comes from not just the preachers on the ground. It comes from the great intellectual movements of the Franciscans, particularly the Franciscans at Oxford. And Roger Bacon, writing very, very in the middle of the 13th century, he writes in the Opus Maius. Obviously writes everything in it, but he does write a very, very important section where we hear a Franciscan discussing the problem of visual arts. And he sends this document to Rome. He says he wants to talk about a representation of forms and images, visual representation of forms and images. He says, for it is impossible for the spiritual sense to be known without a knowledge of the literal sense. But the literal sense cannot be known unless a man knows the significations of the terms and the properties of the things signified. Since, therefore, artificial works like the Ark of Noah and the Temple of Solomon or of Ezekiel or or of other things of this kind are almost without number and placed throughout Scripture, it is not possible for the literal sense to be known unless a man have these works depicted in his senses, but more so when they are pictured in their physical forms, and thus have the sacred writers and sages of old employed pictures in various figures, and that the literal truth might be evident to the eye, and as a consequence the spiritual truth be seen well. And he calls on, this is a very long citation, but the fact is he calls on the artists of Italy. He says we need to train artists in Italy to be able to use geometry to create spaces and scenes so that people can see and understand the literal sense to better understand the spiritual sense. And then he refers to, there are 2 or 3 Latins, or that means Italians, 2 or 3 Latins already at work who we think would be worthy of the task. Giotto, Chima Boy, Cavallini. The reason for this art is so that people can understand and see these stories. They can understand the literal scenes, and because of that, they'll be able to understand the spiritual meaning. And once they do that, you know what that makes you? It makes you, beholder of the painting, a witness. The reason why we have the figure with his back to you is because it's a reminder that Giotto knows you're there. Those works of art are not without strings attached. You look at that work of art, and it's not just an open-ended box in a window into a room where you can stand on this side of the window, and what happens on that side, you can choose to participate or not participate. Once we have these figures with their back to us, we are aware of the fact that we are part of the crowd. We are part of the crowd of onlookers. We are not necessarily there that particular night, but the art of Giotto allows us to be there anyway. And when we are standing here looking at these images, it makes us witness. And as witnesses, just like they were witnesses, it is our job to go out and testify. This art, while delighting the eyes, while giving us great sense of meaning, at the same time, this is the image of perspective, at the same time it also gives us it imposes on us the responsibility of going out and bearing witness to what we have seen. Never is this more accurate than when you're looking at a picture of a martyr. When you're looking at a martyr, he does a beautiful picture of the crucifixion of St. Peter. Peter's being crucified, there's a figure with his back to you. You are witness to Peter's witness. So you need to go testify too. This is just a little bit of how this all boils down into the Renaissance. You have a little bit of Ptolemy, that's for geography. You have a little bit of geometry, as Roger Bacon is talking about. A dash of Alhazen, which is how Roger Bacon got his hands on those texts. And next thing you know, we're going to have Raphael. Raphael comes out of this tradition. Raphael, the desire for geometry and order, the idea of creating spaces that are logical and make sense, it comes out of this very, very important Christian tradition. And so in many ways we see Francis who was able to keep the church from falling down, not only by reconstructing the church bit by bit through his example, through his witness, but also through this great visual tradition. I'm going to close here for this section, and we're going to move into the consequences of the Franciscan Revolution in the next section. So.